Morning, folks. Good morning, everyone. So glad to see you all here. If you are looking for the Arts and Intersections conversation with Eddie Torres, Leah Goodwin, and Jonathan Gluss, you are in the right place, and we're really glad to have you all. My name is Kamal Martin. I'm with the Catalyst team. I lead our work in the networks and initiative space, and we're so excited for this because this represents the next steps of a lot of continued work and the ongoing efforts around uplifting art, culture, culture bearers in the broader creative economy, but through an equity lens that's often absent in a lot of spaces. A couple of quick housekeeping items before we get started. We're gonna have each other today for about an hour and a half. If we could ask everybody keep their microphones on mute in the meantime, but feel free to use the chat liberally. Feel free to introduce yourselves. We'll be taking questions in the chat, so we also hope people will refrain from raising hands or jumping off microphone for a while. And just to give you a little bit of an idea of what the flow of our day is going to look like, we're going to have a presentation from the President and CEO of Grantmakers in the Arts, Eddie Torres. And that'll be followed by a little back and forth of a panel discussion with Jonathan Gluss, who is the Executive Director of San Diego's Arts and Culture Commission, and Leah Goodwin, President and CEO of Goodwin Creations. Before we launch into those pieces, I'd like to briefly acknowledge two of my Catalyst teammates, Aline Racic and Zoe Luis, who have made this possible, also here working tirelessly behind the scenes to make sure things go well. And also, I would like to call out Matt Dorigo from the Claire Rose Foundation, who's been a huge part of this work for a long time. To give you a little bit of context, last year, some of you may have attended a series of virtual events in partnership with Catalyst, the Claire Rose Foundation, and the San Diego Arts and Culture Commission called the State of the Arts. And the intent was to bring a different equity lens to arts funding and this landscape. And we had a couple of focused conversations. One was around justice, one was around education, one was around health and wellness. And what we want to do is to build on those initial efforts in bringing more funders into the arts and culture space who may not see themselves in the arts and culture world, but are impacted by it, who benefit from it, who showcase it when they talk to prospective employees in their sector. Arts and culture is a huge way of attracting people to a region. So what else can we do to make sure that the creators and creatives who live in the space that we are can actually subsist, and not just subsist, but can thrive in this area, and bringing more funders with the ability to leverage their position in different spaces, again, like healthcare, social justice, and all these elements. So with that, I'm going to do a quick introduction of one of my colleagues, Jonathan, with the Arts and Culture Commission. And I also get the privilege of wearing two hats in this conversation, one as a Catalyst team member, but also as an Arts and Culture Commissioner myself. The Commission for Arts and Culture serves as an advisor to the Mayor and City Council on promoting, encouraging, and increasing support of the region's artistic and cultural assets, integrating arts and culture into community life, and showcasing San Diego as an international cultural destination. Established nearly 40 years ago, the Commission has for decades been the largest annual arts and culture funder in the region, providing more than $100 million of operating and program support, and a commission of 15 mayorally appointed residents advise staff, the mayor and council on policy and community-wide engagements. And I see a few of my colleagues on the commission here, Dr. Polito, good to see you, sir, and a few other folks as well, so welcome. And Leah Goodwin, President and CEO of Leah Goodwin Creations. Leah's done so many things and has an incredible background. Her primary belief is that the arts are a universal tool for healing. She's the owner of Leah Goodwin Creations, where arts and soul meet. She has a diverse background that includes strategic planning, fundraising, event and conference coordination, art and culture projects, curating gallery exhibits, creating art master plans. Her skill sets range from public arts management to visual and performing arts program development, consultation, implementation of award-winning, educational and arts programs in hospitals. She's held a range of leadership roles ranging from the Director of Visual and Performing Arts at the Jacob Center for Neighborhood Innovation in San Diego, the Director of Museum Education for the California Center for Arts, She's done incredible work as a proud founding faculty member of RISE San Diego. In August, she recently curated the 1619 celebration of the Black Women exhibit for the California Women's Museum. And on top of that, she's also an accomplished poet, writer, author. She's won Moxie Awards for her work, just an incredible talent and asset to the region. And Mr. Gluss, who I mentioned, is the city's executive director for arts and culture. He leads the city's investment in the arts and culture sectors, working with partners in philanthropy, tourism, community activation, and binational and international initiatives. He's currently the city's lead on the binational Tijuana World Design Capital 2024 project, and will lead the city's first cultural planning process, which he'll go into in a little bit more detail. Mr. Gluss has 2 decades of experience in the public sector in senior cultural leadership roles in Houston, Texas, Los Angeles, Pasadena, Chicago, Illinois, Sacramento, California. And his arts career began with the International Sculpture Center in Washington, D.C., where he wrote for the Sculpture magazine and traveled exhibitions internationally. He's a graduate of the Liberal Arts and Urban Economics program and public policy at Indiana University and Earlham College, pursued master's work in art and architectural history at the University of Illinois, later receiving a certificate in British urban policy at the University of Kent in Canterbury, England. So Jonathan brings an incredible background and array of skill sets for our region as well. And I will let Jonathan introduce his friend and colleague and our esteemed guest from the East Coast today, Mr. Eddie Torres.
Thank you, Kamal. Thank you, Commissioner Kamal. Kamal and I like to remind ourselves that I met Kamal when he said to me, the commission needs to do better. Commission needs to do better in the way that it communicates with community, and the commission needs to do better in the way that it intentionally is investing and advancing in our arts community. So from that point on, Kamal and I have been good colleagues, and I couldn't be happier that you're on the commission now, Kamal. I also want to give a shout out to the other commissioners that are with us today. We're on quite a fast track at the Commission for Arts and Culture right now. And I'm really happy that some of the commissioners can be with us today. This work is really timely and important to us at the Commission. During the past few years, we've been deeply involved in assessing the work of the city through the Commission for Arts and Culture, to ensure that our work aligns with the values and priorities of the city, and most importantly, the values of the community that we serve. 3 years ago, we commissioned an equity audit of our work, which recommended a series of policy and procedural shifts, which we have been implementing during the past 2 years. Those changes have resulted in the highest number of new applications to the funding program, and a substantial reduction in barriers to applying for funding and managing a city grants contract. We've also increased our technical assistance to nearly 100 hours, with special emphasis on communities of concern and BIPOC communities. In this fall, we'll be launching the city's first cultural planning process, which will ultimately align our city's investments in arts, culture, and creative industries with the city's larger priorities of affordable housing, equitable workforce development, environmental justice, and a deep commitment to recognize our cultural and economic alliances as a border city with our sister city, the city of Tijuana. Inviting Eddie today to this conversation seemed like a perfect time, in that the Grantmakers in the Arts works with public and private agencies across the country that are doing similar work. So I couldn't be more delighted to introduce Eddie as President and CEO of Grantmakers in the Arts. GIA is the National Association of Public and Private Arts and Culture Funders in the United States, including independent and family foundations, public agencies, community foundations, nonprofit regranters, and national service organizations. GIA is not a grant maker, but rather a professional association of funders. Increasingly, GIA serves as a forum for education among funders interested in centering racial and social justice in their work. It has been the president and CEO of Grantmakers in the Arts, or GIA, since 2017, and served on the board of GIA since 2011. Prior to that position, Eddie was a deputy commissioner of cultural affairs for the city of New York, a program officer at the Rockefeller Foundation, and has worked at the Ford Foundation, among other agencies. He has degrees from Hunter College and the New School, and I couldn't be more delighted to turn the mic over virtually to Eddie Torres.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, for having me. I want to say a great big thank you to Catalyst for hosting this conversation. I also want to say a great big thank you to Claire Rose Foundation, Price Charities, and to all of you who are taking time out of your schedule to spend this time with us. So I'm really excited to be able to have this conversation because it sounds really aligned with the kinds of conversations we enjoy participating in, and it's very timely in terms of conversations that are happening nationally. So essentially, Grantmakers in the Arts is an industry association, very much like Catalyst. We engage in professional development, workshops. We have our conference coming up in October. Come on down to New York City. We actually have a workshop open now for November, the Pro BIPOC Arts Funding Workshop, and those sell out quickly. So if you get a chance, go ahead and register now. As Jonathan said before this, I was with the City of New York, and I'm going to go ahead and ask, I know my colleagues are sharing my slides. Let me go ahead and ask you to go ahead and start sharing my slides, and I'll work from those. Beautiful. Excellent. Let's go. Excellent. And let's go. Okay, great. Let's go to the one after this. Fantastic. Thank you. So, before this role, I was with the city government in New York. And we engaged a third-party consulting firm to do a study of the diversity of the workforce in arts and culture in New York. And what we basically came to find, now New York is a fairly diverse place. We're really only about a third white. And what we came to find was that, one, the arts workforce was not particularly diverse, but there was an inverse relationship between our funding at the City of New York, our funding, and the diversity of our grantees. By which I mean, what we basically came to find was you were more likely to be diverse if you got very small amounts from us. You were less likely to be diverse if you got very large amounts from us. And that was because, like so many agencies, we basically used kind of formulas for our funding that basically meant those with bigger budgets got bigger grants, right? And those with smaller budgets got smaller grants, right? And this is not at all uncommon. This is oftentimes referred to as formula funding, et cetera. But what it basically meant was that not being diverse paid really well, right? And being diverse pays really poorly, right? And we all experience this in so many other facets of our lives. And, we oftentimes experience this as individuals in our lives. And so while, we started this process thinking we were going to look at them being our grantees, what we had to do was look at ourselves as a funding agency and say, well, if we care about this, why are we doing the opposite? Why are we financing the absence of diversity as opposed to financing the presence of diversity? So basically, this was preamble to our developing. Now, Jonathan here this is old hat for Jonathan, who's done all these cultural plans. This is the first time the city of New York had ever done a cultural plan. So we did the first cultural plan in our city's history, and we basically said, the future of this agency and the city has to be increasing the money that's going to BIPOC communities, that's going to BIPOC artists, that's going to BIPOC organizations, and also that's going to artists with disabilities and the organizations that serve them and that are led by them. And this was, first of all, just really important for us to come to realize as a city agency, but we were also really very lucky that we were in dialogue with grant makers in the arts throughout this experience. I was on the board of directors at the time, and I was lucky that I was on the board of directors at a time when, under my predecessor, Janet Brown, grant makers in the arts was really coming to embrace racial equity. Could we go to the next slide? Now, racial equity, I just want to be clear what I'm talking about, because oftentimes when we use the term DEI, we're conflating three different things. They're all good things. They're just not interchangeable things, So diversity is basically the range of folks who are represented, who are present, right? Your point of intervention when it comes to diversity is oftentimes your hiring process, your programming, who's in the chair, who's on the wall, or who's on the stage, right? Inclusion is basically, once you've got them, you actually listen to them, right? And so then your point of intervention is oftentimes your management processes, your governance processes, maybe your programming processes, right? Equity is essentially about the allocation of resources for self-determination. In other words, it's no longer I'm including them, it's, they have the option of including me, Your point of intervention is usually bigger in scale. It's usually resources. It's usually distribution of power. It's policies, systems, structures. And so we contend that equity, therefore, is a unique opportunity for funders because you have the opportunity to interscale, to intervene at a greater scale, because you can intervene at the portfolio scale, right? So you've got resources for an intervention at more than just my organization. You've got an entire portfolio of organizations, plus you've got a network of other folks like you who also have resources. We go to the next one. So I also just want to honor those who came before and who really led grant makers in the arts embrace of racial equity. On the top middle is my predecessor, Janet Brown, under whom grant makers in the arts really embraced racial equity. And to her left, I guess it's to her right, but to our left on the top is Claudine Brown, the late Claudine Brown, who was a real leader in our field. She was with the Nathan Cummings Foundation when she began really leading our organization as a member to embrace racial equity in arts funding. On the top right is Carlton Turner, who runs Mississippi Center for Cultural Production and prior led Alternate Roots. Again, a member who really led us to the embrace of racial equity. On the bottom left is Denise Brown from Leeway Foundation. Bottom middle is Justin Lang from, at the time, Heinz Endowment. And on the bottom right is Maureen Knighton. She's now with Doris Duke Charitable Foundation. And as members and as members of a governing body, these are the ones who really said, diversity is all well and good, but it has to be stronger. It has to be about self-determination, and it has to be about BIPOC people's leadership and how we finance and facilitate that. So can we go to the next slide? So, you know, our partners in the field and our board have brought the embrace of racial equity from a discrete program to what has become a core value. So now we're no longer like identifying it as a track in our conference, et cetera, because we aspire for it to be integrated in all of our work. With that said, when we do discrete racial equity programming, it's the most popular thing we do. It sells out every time. So these are actually our, this one on the left-hand side is actually, the registration is open now. So get in there while you can. This is for a workshop we're gonna be hosting in November. And these are our racial equity in arts funding workshops. They're a series of 4 3-hour workshops where we have folks from the field leading and sharing their work. Can we go to the next one? So, you know, we talk about racial equity and we feel that racial equity is foundational to intersectional and economic justice. And we think that's important because there are many, many forms of oppression in the world. And so, well, why would we foreground racial equity specifically? So I just want to talk about that so we're all kind of on the same page using shared language. You know, there's 3 major reasons. You know, one, when you look at oppressed people's communities, people of color still face the worst social outcomes. Those other forms of oppression are, of course, completely worth taking seriously. But let's look at women, for instance. Women generally earn like 80 cents on the dollar compared to a man, right? That's ridiculous. I mean, in this day and age, that is insane. But it's 80 cents on the dollar if she's white. If she's Black, it's about 65 cents on the dollar. If she's Latinx, it's about 61 cents on the dollar. If you look at the trans community, trans people in the aggregate are about twice as likely to live in extreme poverty as the general population. That's if they're white. If they're Latinx, it's about 7 times the poverty rate. If they're Black, it's about 8 times the poverty rate. About 72% of Americans are white. Only about 20% of the trans people that have been the victims of racial violence are white. That means 80% of the trans people that are victims of racial violence are trans people of color. Or if you look at disability, for instance, about 24% of people with a disability live in poverty. But again, that's if they're white. If they're Black, it's 40%. So I could go on and on like this. Then the second reason is that historically, the strategies of combining considerations of race with other considerations have resulted in racialized people being pushed into the background. If you look at the first few decades of affirmative action, the primary beneficiaries have been women who were white, right? If you look at educational outcomes, if you look at workplace outcomes. And this gets us into the third piece, which is the fact of the matter is, of course, women deserve affirmative action. When you look at 80 cents on the dollar being the good news, but we believe that the US's creation of race was established to keep oppressed people separate, right? So if you look at the statistics around the correlation between different framing and support for or opposition to policies that affect people broadly, once they're racialized, that support falls away. So the vast majority of challenges to affirmative action have actually been from white women, who are the primary beneficiaries of affirmative action. And that's because in the public dialogue, it gets racialized. And this has actually been quantified. I mean, the same thing is true by the way of like welfare, Medicaid, basically every form of public support. The primary beneficiaries are low-income white folks. Low-income white folks who deserve those public benefits, but who are actually opposing them as long as they're racialized, right? So the myths of, the welfare queen and et cetera, et cetera. So therefore, we feel that it's important that we not be race exclusive, but we are race explicit. And it's for that reason, well, those three reasons. Can we go to the next slide? Okay, so, how does this racialization show up? I mean, so often, what we hear is, well, that's obviously out in the world, where the art world, what does that have to do with me? Well, when you look at the outcomes of this racialization, they're stark. The largest white theater in the US has a general annual budget, an annual operating budget of $50 to $60 million. But the largest Black theater has an operating budget of about $4 million. The largest Latinx theater has an operating budget of about $3 million. So these manifest in ways that are extremely palpable. We'll get to the next slide. Now, where did all of this come from? Now, we can look at any manifestation of racialization in policies and practices and trace its history so that we can see, well, what's the context in which I'm operating? And, was this my fault? I woke up on a Wednesday and decided to, finance the Black theater at a lower level. Well, if you look at giving practices, this is giving practices broadly, but also inclusive of giving practices as regards arts and culture, they largely come out of, once they became increasingly formalized, they came out of, sort of the 1800s, maybe the second half of the 1800s, when we started moving from individual donor practice into kind of more formal foundation practice. We've always had individual donor practice. We had donations before we had a tax system. But when you look at how arts and culture funding became the form that we know it today, this is around mid to late 1800s, when you had folks looking to put their city for the first time on the world map. At the time, we were a new country, the cities were new, we're looking to establish ourselves as world-class cities. Well, at that time, if you're looking at what's a world-class city, you were looking at Western Europe, So you were supporting Western European art. And this was more than just an aesthetic orientation. When you're supporting one person's cultural forms over another, you're asserting who does and doesn't have not just culture, but basic humanity, And it wasn't just, but the Black enslaved people or formerly enslaved people or the Native Americans, but you also had Eastern Europeans who were still relatively new arrivals and who had not yet integrated into whiteness. That's why Eastern European art still gets lumped in, for instance, with craft, and those are the kinds of hierarchies that got established at the time. This is around the time when the first arts institutions were coming online here. It's also the time when the settlement house movement was beginning, and you had the practice of supporting folks' culture from where they're from as part of supporting immigrant communities. And it was also beginning to be sort of understood through donors' practices what was and wasn't valued, right? Because you had tiny little budgets going to service provision, tiny little donations going to serve arts and culture for immigrant communities as part of service provision, right? Hull House was established like a mile and a half away from the Art Institute of Chicago, and Hull House had cultural programming as part of their service provision. And then you also had at the time the newly rich establishing not only their city as a world-class city, but establishing themselves as wealthy people. This is a new country, a young country, and these were newly rich people, which was a very American phenomenon. Before that, in Western Europe, being rich was almost a generational designation. You could be rich without having any money, So you had for the first time people who were rich whose parents were poor. you know, and you have sort of the you know, famous robber barons, et cetera. So you then had philanthropy as conspicuous consumption, you know, and so this is where we get the idea, this is where we get several, you know, pretty bad best practices in arts giving. You know, one is conspicuous consumption that is giving as branding. So, you know, I'm going to give and you're going to name this wing after me. I'm going to give and you're going to name this position after me, et cetera, right? But that's also how you wind up with organizations who are very well financed as regards their programming or their physical facilities, but very poorly financed as regards just paying staff, keeping the lights on, et cetera, et cetera. It's also where you get the idea of leverage, the idea of I'm giving, but you're going to get more money from my having given. And then me and the other folks who gave are going to stand around on Friday night drinking white wine, right? So this wound up begetting two practices. Well, a couple of practices, but two big ones. One was the idea that an organization, their board of directors had to be made of rich people. Like that was your primary qualification for being on a board of directors, right? And it also is where you got, you're a good organization, you're an effective organization if you know a bunch of rich people, right? This is where you get kind of the idea that somebody who is connected to the wealthy is inherently a better museum director, theater director, fill in the blank, right? And then this wound up going from individual donor practice, it wound up becoming codified. So let's go to the next slide. So, you know, this wound up becoming imported into foundation practice. Foundations began to come online around the turn of the 20th century, hitting their high water mark, kind of the middle of the 20th century with you know, the Ford Foundations becoming as you know, the form that we've come to know it as. This is under McGeorge Bundy and the vice presidency of W. McNeill Lowry. And it was at this point under Mac Lowry, the VP, who was a really, really robust arts supporter, that it became codified in writing that an effective grant was a grant that yielded more money. So this is where you start getting things like the 2-to-1 match, et cetera. And this wound up becoming standardized practice throughout foundations in general. But what happened shortly after this point in history is the National Endowment for the Arts coming online. And then that becoming ingrained in public practice. The NEA begets all of the state arts agencies, city arts agencies start emerging, and all of these practices that had once been the province of individual donors now get institutionalized through foundations and public agencies. Now, I say this for a specific reason, you know, I mean, this all may or may not be interesting to you, but the good news is you didn't create this. You didn't wake up on Wednesday and decide that there should be, you know, poorly financed Black organizations and well-financed white organizations. This has been happening since before the turn of last century, right? And the good news is that the people who did create this were just flesh and blood like you, right? The bad news is you've got, you know, over a century of momentum, and we're beginning to see changes now. Those changes can be frustratingly slow, but it's good to know the history that we're dealing with as we try to replace those practices. I see I'm running out of time, so I'm going to go ahead and start to wrap us up. Let's go to the next slide. So since the pandemic began, we basically said, okay, now we're seeing changes in practices more broadly. Folks are becoming more flexible. The reporting is falling away. The proposals are getting easier. We wanted to see what's happening with the racialization of arts funding. And so what we're essentially seeing among our members is increasing support going to these are studies we did in 2020 and then again in 2021. We're seeing increasing support going to BIPOC artists and organizations. We're not sure about the future. Like everybody else, we can't predict the future, but we're happy with the trends that we're seeing. So let's go to the next slide. So in 2020, 65% of our members said they would increase giving to BIPOC-led organizations, and in 2021, 63% said they had, and just over 50% said they will in the future. So pretty good. We're really happy with that. We didn't quantify the levels of increases, by the way. We just quantified giving more, you know? Let's go to the next one. And in 2021, which is the first time we asked about giving to individual BIPOC artists or cultural workers, 50% said they had increased giving to BIPOC artists and cultural workers, and over a third said that they will. Where we do see the field needing to catch up, though, is artists with disabilities and trans artists. We think that this is a great opportunity for intersectionality and a great opportunity to think about who is and isn't well financed more broadly. And let me go to the next slide. I think I might skip a few just to wrap us up because I'm realizing okay, good. So I'm actually going to wrap us up here. You know, we're really, really grateful to see these improvements in our members' practices. But we specifically want to highlight what we're seeing in terms of members working together. So there's three examples I want to bring up. You know, so one of them is Enrich Chicago. Now, this effort started in 2014. It's basically a collaboration of over 40 Chicago cultural institutions and funders who are basically working together to end the racialization of arts and culture giving. Basically, they're a collaborative effort that has, you know, a paid staff member who's a coordinator. They provide anti-racism learning and capacity building. They increase leadership opportunities for BIPOC arts administrators. They increase equitable access to resources and funding for BIPOC organizations. Now, the other couple of efforts I want to bring up is the Twin Cities Theater of Color Coalition. These are 5 theaters of color in the Twin Cities, which are basically working together to build knowledge of different cultural forms and different organizations in the Twin Cities for the broader community, but specifically also in dialogue with the funding community. And they're working in partnership with the Racial Equity Funders Collaborative, which is a group of arts funders who are looking to do likewise in terms of changing their own practices, but also changing the practices of their peers. And it's not just their peers in the Twin Cities. Like Enrich Chicago, they were both huge inspirations to the Mosaic Learning Network and Fund in New York City, which is a collaboration of about 30 donors who are looking to support BIPOC organizations whose budgets are so small that they've generally fallen under the radar of even those 30 funders. It's been a combination of general operating support, capacity building support, but intense dialogue that has begun with the funders learning from those organizations what it is that they need to do in terms of their changed practices, but increasingly ceding power over this effort to the organizations themselves. And at this point, the organizations are becoming the governing body for this effort. And so I say all this for a reason, and I'm going to wrap us up so that we can go into dialogue together. But, you know, so often when we have conversations with our members about all of this, they see these huge disparities. You see this 100+ years of history, et cetera, and they say, this is so big. What can I do about it? I'm one person at one institution. You know, it's so big, I'm so small. And the fact of the matter is, they're right. It is so big, and we as individuals are so small. But that's only true if we remain individuals, and it's only true if we continue to simply approach this just as individuals. The fact of the matter is, you are small as an individual, but we're not small as a field, right? The field is whose practice we're ultimately looking to change, and we can only do that together. We can only make these changes to our future when we do it together. It's overwhelming initially, and you're going to make mistakes, and we're all going to stumble. Personally, I always say I try to look dumb in public at least a couple of times a week, right? Because if I don't, it means I'm not making any real effort and I'm not learning anything. So in that spirit, let me go ahead and open this so I can look dumb in dialogue with all of you.
Eddie, thank you so much for the history, the context, and the insight. The next portion of our program, we're just going to spend a little bit of time with Eddie, Jonathan, and Leah, just kind of doing a little bit of a jazz riff back and forth on some of their reflections and expertise. And I'd like to tee up Miss Goodwin first. Leah, you've done so many things as an individual artist and administrator, as well as with the city, with the county. If you could share a couple of reflections that you have in terms of what you heard today, equity, what it means to be a Black artist. One of the things that you'd mentioned to me before that I always stuck with is the difference between art and culture and what gets funded in some of those spaces. Art and culture is often the first thing on the chopping block when there are funding shortfalls, but it's one of the first things people look for when things crumble around us, which is one of the lessons of the pandemic. What are some of the things that stand out for you today, Leah?
Well, hello, friends. So nice to see so many of you. I think the fact that we, first of all, separate art and culture is part of the root of the problem, because they're not different things, and it relates to some of the things that Eddie. I mean, I just loved listening to you. I was like, said about fine art, high art, and there. And I've been in the field for 30 years, and I will say, friends, that I was like the only person of color art administrator, and often, the only female. So I do get excited, Kamal, seeing you and the faces here as a sign of progress. But there was some great nuggets, Eddie, and I started just writing them down. Being race explicit. Whew. Since I sit with that one for a minute, not just equity, inclusion, but race explicit. That's interesting. Bad best practices in giving. Okay. I mean, I don't know if they stuck out to everybody else as much as they stuck out to me. The racialization of arts funding, wow. It's so big and we are so small. So I stuck with those, just kind of reached out so much that I had to write them down, because when you're saying, like, what did I think about? And I do feel like, I mean, having spent my whole life in the arts, and starting, very small organization, the African American Writers and Artists, when I arrived in San Diego, that doesn't exist. And then fast forward to 2018 when Jonathan Glass showed up in San Diego, and it's like, what is going on here? Where are the Black art and culture folks? And it's like, well, we're here. We're volunteers. We're doing great things. And it is, and it's always the artist will do it anyway because we have to, right? Like, I would love to stop writing poetry, but it's just not going to happen in my lifetime. Will I be a Maya Angelou and reach the Fortune 500? It's not even on my list. So I think that the changes are happening, and in San Diego, especially just since 2020, watching the commission take a stand, watching the partnerships happen between the foundation and funders, watching my friends here at the San Diego Creative Youth Development Network and Claire Rose Foundation. Hello, Matt. A shout out to Matt and the team. Who took a big step back and said, what are we doing? We serve youth. How are we serving our youth? What what's going on with them. If we look at what's going on with us, and we don't have our race thoughts and feelings and practices and even words together, how are we going to serve? Add that on to it kind of being empowering in our communities. I mean, in this last 6 months, the city of San Diego District 4 claimed its Black Art and Culture District. Long overdue. But the resolution happened, and the movement is happening, and the tide is shifting, so that we can really look at what are we doing, how do we create good best practices. And I love the last thing you said about it's so big and we're so small, but we're working together. There will be a lot of shifts. So I've been in these streets a while, people, and I'm still here, and I'm happy to be here, Kamal and Jonathan. Thank you for your grace, Eddie. I wanted to hear the whole presentation and more work, and because I think we are all learning together, and at least we're learning together now. At least we're learning together now that you're creating these spaces for us to go, yeah, wow, that worked, but it really only worked for some, and geez, the world needs us more than it ever needed us before. If we as an arts community can't get our inclusion and our equity and our race explicit work together, but I'm hopeful that we can.
Thank you for that, Leah. Mr. Gluss, if you could share a couple of reflections and things that stood out for you in Eddie's presentation.
So I also really appreciated the comment about racially explicit. Leah worked with the Commission for Arts and Culture, relatively recently. I think about 6 months ago, to refine our racial equity statement. And it was firstly long overdue, but it was interesting to watch you, Leah, work with the commission through that process, because moving us away from city policy and the structures of local governments, which Eddie, you know really well, working in New York, and calling out race as a fundamental concern, priority in an intentional way is incredibly uncomfortable for bureaucrats. It's incredibly uncomfortable for those of us who work in the civic space. We've been so trained to be race neutral. To actually call it out is, firstly, it's it's incredibly liberating, because you're saying what is in front of us. But it also is, we know that's challenging for our colleagues in much of the work that we do. So that just, Eddie, you using that statement really brought me back to only a few months ago when Leah led us through that really important work that we're building on now. Obviously, funding formula was a big red flag for me. That is our legacy system here. Two other things, stepping aside from legacy, from formula funding, two other things: collective impact and BIPOC led. I really appreciated, Eddie, the fact that you called out a few models of collective impact that are intentionally focused not on geography, but on race. We have not been as successful in that space in our region yet. in this space of arts and culture. I can't speak for some of the other spaces, but in the space of arts and culture, we're having a lot of conversations about that, but we really haven't arrived on a model yet, and we haven't identified partners yet. I think that's incredibly important. That's the type of work that the city can't necessarily do, that we have to really rely on our private philanthropy colleagues and partners to lead the way on. There are so many state restrictions on how we actually can do the work as a municipal government in California. We have to rely on our foundational partners to do that specific type of work, that we can support it, but we can't take the lead on it. And I really appreciated, though this is not a new term at all, but BIPOC-led. I think a lot of people still struggle with the notion of why it's important to invest in BIPOC-led organizations. And that the fundamental question of an organization that is serving BIPOC communities, isn't that enough? And why do we have to take the additional step of investing in BIPOC-led? So I appreciate you bringing that up. And I'd love to hear any more comments you have about that, Eddie.
Well, I mean, for us, and I want to be clear. I mean, I have a life and career and a professional network filled with white allies. I think that, I don't want to give short shrift to allyship, which I think is essential. I think that historically, when GIA moved into, okay, let's look at equity as self-determination by BIPOC, communities, we were basically saying, well, why has diversity yielded such marginal results, And essentially, we were saying, well, the power dynamic has basically remained the same. And so we essentially looked to the financing of BIPOC-led organizations as kind of a manifestation of self-determination by BIPOC organizations, so one. And then the other really interesting, complicated factor, which we're encountering more recently, and it feels maybe more generational, is community members basically saying, yes to all of that. I don't necessarily want to run a 501c3. Is there some other structure that somehow feels, life-giving to me than a 501c3 with a governing body and ... And so, that's now currently really challenging our members in ways that I think plenty of them have an appetite for, but we've been set up for generations to support 501c3 nonprofits. That's not necessarily a form that came from, the communities we want to serve. So, can we accommodate different forms?
Go ahead, Leah.
So that's so interesting. So I wear a lot of hats as a consultant, but we recently, the city commission recently received, had a grant from the California Arts Council to do marketing work and lift up BIPOC organizations with this idea that, if they had these sessions, they would be able to, hopefully, apply for some grants or understand the grant writing process and the grant process. So it's quite interesting. And I did this, so I was part of this consulting team with Rise San Diego, where I teach an urban leadership program. And we got a lot of applicants, and we ended up with about 30. And that whole, here we thought we were jumping in, but you have to meet people where they're at, right? So we thought we were jumping into, here's the process, and here's how you get your budgets together, and, create your logic model, and do all these sort of things. And we ended up in a room with people who are like, we just need money. um, and we're running as volunteers. And geez, I mean, a paid staff, and so we had to like do this completely flip around on our sessions, and meet them where they were. And 5 of these people were organizations of color who had been around for 30 years. They'd lost their founder, whatever, and they were, I mean, making a program budget ended up being part of what we were, and it was, I'm very rarely surprised. Jonathan knows this, but I was really surprised, and sadly not in a great way. And there were some people who just said, it costs money to be a 501c3. It looks like it's I'll be a 501c3 and the money will come. And yeah, no, maybe it's just better to be a working artist and believe in your org or collaborate with someone. One of the things, and we talked a lot about using fiscal sponsors, because geez, you're not even ready to launch a program budget. I'm not going to tell you to be a 501c3, and they weren't grant ready. So this idea of teaching them to write a grant was like, oh hi, we want to teach this because we said we'd get up and do it, and we did do as much as we could, but yeah, it was quite an eye opener for all of us, I think. I hope that adds to the conversation.
I have a question that I'd maybe like to pose for Jonathan first, but I'd definitely love to hear from Eddie and Leah as well. Jonathan, you talked a little bit about the city of San Diego's first cultural plan. If you could expand a little bit on like the significance of that long term and what that means in terms of the opportunity we have in front of us. And Leah and Eddie, in your experience in other communities, the role that cultural plans have played in possibly shifting and addressing some of this cultural hegemony that's embedded in the funders and the institutions themselves.
So thanks, Kamal. So I would say first and foremost, going back to Eddie's term, self-determination, this will be the first time that the community writ large weighs in on cultural policies at the city. So this will quite literally be community members that don't have official participation roles in the nonprofit art space, or even individual artists, will weigh in on real basics. How do they identify art in their community? How do they identify culture in their community? What is the role of culture bearers, artists, creative businesses in their community? And some real fundamental questions. Do they want to experience it on their terms in their community? Or is there continued commitment to the really fine institutions that we have? In other words, this is a large, sprawling city. Do they want to identify arts and culture in their community, and they want to determine how the city invests in their community in that space? In addition to the larger nonprofit ecosystem. The truth is, we have one of the largest portfolios of cultural facilities that the city owns in the country. The community writ large has never weighed in and said how they want to prioritize this tremendous investment that the city invests in the community every year. So it's really that baseline. On a very positive note, and that is why I'm enthusiastic about this. This will be community-led, community dialogue, telling City Hall how we should identify our policies and craft our policies. Secondly, we're going to invest, we're going to posit arts and culture and artists in the work of the city. So we're actually going to be able, we're very committed to this. When this is done, we want to be able to say the role of arts, culture, and creativity in solving or in addressing issues such as mental health, gang prevention, housing and homelessness issues, environmental justice, social justice, the priorities of the city. We want artists, culture bearers, and the nonprofit space to be at the table in all of those conversations. And we can do that through policy. So I'll stop there. I get very excited about this. And I will say, Hetty, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but one of I appreciate the way that you positioned the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, or kind of the history. For better or for worse, the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs is, I believe, the largest public funder of the arts, larger than the NEA. But the legacy system that was created has been modeled across the country, and it is not an equitable model, or it has not historically been. So many cities are now trying to resolve that issue that was adopted by the city of New York 50, 60, 70 years ago.
No, this is really interesting. You know, we had the experience of, when we did the cultural plan, of working to engage, you know, a broad cross section of the public, and private philanthropy came and basically financed the city's sort of BIPOC artists and organizations to sort of organize and to inform the plan, you know. And oftentimes we're, you know, sort of, it's New York City, or dukes up, you know, it's just such a bare knuckle culture. And, you know, what we experienced was really unexpected, which was towards the end of our process, you know, we had assumed that it was going to be kind of this fight for the, you know, between the primary beneficiaries of the city's funding, which is, you know, larger institutions, and, you know, a bunch of the small organizations, right? And towards the end, the BIPOC artists and organizations presented, you know, sort of list of demands and things. One of the things that they actually said, which I had not anticipated at all, was they said, you can't cut your way to equity. They actually didn't want us to cut the major institutions. They did want us to increase, they wanted us to increase the funding to the organizations and communities of color to the point where they were comparably resourced, right? Which in the aggregate would have literally octupled our budget, right? So that wasn't actually possible in the long term, but it did allow us to you know, advocate for, you know, continuous increases to those communities and organizations. But their line of reasoning was just so meat and potatoes. Their line of reasoning was this. They said, look, if those organizations, those big institutions, take a funding cut, where is that going to be felt? They said they're not going to cut their programming. They're going to cut personnel. That's what everybody does. That's what private business does. Anybody takes a funding cut, or anybody takes an income cut. What you do is you cut personnel, right? And everybody works a little harder and blah, blah, blah. And they said, when those positions are cut, who's going to be harmed? It's going to be the most recently hired. It's going to be the people in the lowest places in the hierarchy. And basically what you're going to do is you're going to have mass layoffs of BIPOC people in New York art world. Those are the people we most want to protect. So our advocacy is for increasing funding to our communities not decreasing funding to the historic recipients. That was really huge. One, it was unexpected, but also it was very it was systems thinking, it was long-term thinking, etc. So we were really like taken aback.
We're coming up on time for this portion of our dialogue and conversation, and I want to make sure that we also save time to open up the dialogue to everyone on this call, so we can continue to cross-pollinate our thinking. Before we do that, question for the last, or for each of you to kind of wrap up and transition. If you had a message to philanthropy for the funders on this call, what would that be?
Okay, I'll try. I think I've been sitting with your last statement, Eddie, and I think it's just that idea that it's not an either or, it's a both and. It's an altogether thing. It's a listening to understand thing. It's a really shifting paradigms and being bold. Why not? Why not be bold? And I'm, grateful that I feel like Jonathan is a partner of mine. I will text him, hey, did you? I mean, and he'll respond. And that's so I really have been feeling hopeful that it is a new day. Sadly, everything we've had to go through to get here, but we're here. So let's both end and be brave and work together. I mean, if you ask the community will talk to you like they did.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I would just quickly offer collective impact. The city can't do it alone. We all have roles and lanes in the community. We have levers of influence, and we also all have limitations. But a kind of a collective understanding of the landscape of the community is really important.
Yeah, and I think related to both of your remarks is to think in terms of systems, to recognize you're part of a larger ecosystem and you touch other ecosystems. And that gives you opportunities to have impact beyond just, your desk and your 9 to 5.
Much appreciation, folks. You've given us so much to think about, and let's continue the inquiry while we still have some time together. I'd like to circle back to a question that Commissioner Polito had posed in the chat a while back. Wonderful presentation, Eddie. I feel like I felt for so long in terms of getting resources and support in our communities of color. Do we fight to get into the existing centers of power and resources that provide funding, or do we create our own, right? And then our Catalyst CEO, Megan Thomas, addressed that as well, with her thoughts being, her response is both, right? Work to change from within, and there also needs to be an entirely new way of thinking about resourcing. What's your take on that, Eddie?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree in terms of both. I mean, oftentimes we think of these things in terms of binaries, and the fact of the matter is, I know so many folks who are, radicals who recognize, but between here and there, we're going to need to take care of people. If I'm looking to just entirely replace a system, I have to recognize that there are people right now who I care about who, are able to feed themselves because of the current system, and I need to recognize there's a here, there's a there, but in between, there's the potential for harm if we're not at least considerate of the fact.
Thanks for that, Eddie. Dr. Polito, if I could actually ask you, expand a little bit more on this piece you had mentioned around the binary and its connection to self-determination.
Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate this. This is wonderful. I'm here in San Diego, member of the commission, and excited to announce that we're opening up a museum at Chicano Park on October 8th. So we hope all of you will be there. I can say a lot. I'm in higher ed. Even how I received an education was a really smart mentor who received money from outside the institution and then got us educated. The institution didn't care about us, but because he got resources, suddenly he was important. And I'm one of 57 people that went through a higher ed education because of this gentleman who got the money. So that's what I'm thinking about. Now, for us, when you're mentioning self-determination, it becomes, for us, a political term, and it has to be defined by those who embrace it. So for me to depend on self-determination coming from outside of that is problematic, unless we need to work with it. I'm very pleased to see that in the narrative that you shared, but how do we continue to take control of that in a way that if we get resources from the outside, then we could still determine that. I think Jonathan hit on the fact that maybe if we give monies to communities and let them work with it, maybe that's the way to do it. And I just have one more thought which came up during this. One thing we haven't even touched on, and it's happening here, is gentrification. Art is what leads this, and it's changing our neighborhood, changing it in ways that are just insane. So I just want to throw that out there also as a thing for us to explore. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Dr. Polito. And one of the things that's actually come up in the last policy and advocacy subcommittee meeting for the Arts and Culture Commission, we were talking a lot about housing and the relationship between art and housing and artification, and the extent to which this cultural plan that the city is going to be working on has to include non-arts actors as part of the integration in that space along that path towards opening the doors to a different form of self-determination, as opposed to someone with funding telling you, this is what we're determining for yourself, right? Matt, if you could go ahead and share a little bit more about the question you had related to infrastructure and impact models in cross-sector philanthropy.
Sure. I made a couple of comments, so they're kind of combined. Well, first, Eddie, good to see you. Matt Rodriguez with the Claire Rose Foundation. San Diego is a very different philanthropic environment for arts and culture. Very different than Boston. That's a similar size, but very rich in foundations and history of philanthropy in arts and culture. So it is what it is, right? So we're working within this space within San Diego. So the question we've been asking, me and Jonathan especially, of how do we engage funders outside of traditional arts and culture, in health and wellness, in social justice, and community development, workforce development. So we're just beginning to work on that and create a working group, to some structure for some collective action work. I'm just curious if you've seen any other successful models around the country that have engaged non-arts funders. And the other element to this is that a lot of the large funding in arts and culture is from individual community, not from foundation. So there's several dynamics impacting sustainable and I guess healthy, vibrant support for smaller community-based organizations. And so just that intersectionality is something I think we can tap into.
That's really smart thinking. I mean, the examples that I tend to see tend to be related to the overlap between arts and health. The positive impacts on health, physical, mental, and also just sort of at a community scale of the arts are really, really robustly documented. I mean, the impacts of arts on a number of things are well documented, but it's health that I think is most robustly documented. And so it tends to be where I see non-arts funders actually invest in the arts toward their, desired end. And you see that with like the California Endowment, and a report that came out recently called Saludarte, which it was Alliance of California Traditional Arts, had engaged a number of community engagement events, cultural events, but specifically toward community scale health interventions. You also see this in Philadelphia, with the MAP project that's been really, really well documented. And I can send you, I can send Catalyst and Jonathan all this documentation to share out. So you see folks like Richmond Memorial Health Foundation supporting the arts. You also see there's more of it that lives in the public sector than is particularly visible. I remember, we had, the folks from Social Impact of the Arts Project come and do a study of the positive impact of arts engagement I think it was, what they found was positive impacts in education, health, and public safety. And so this is when I was with the city. And so we filled a room with, the public agencies who were relevant. So it was a room full of educators, doctors, and police. And we explained the report findings, and they said, yeah, we know. We all have budgets that part of which goes to arts engagement, because we know the benefit to health and safety, et cetera. What they did ask was to not mention it, because those parts of their budgets were so minuscule that the Office of Management and Budget never perceived them. And so if we were to highlight them, they would be flagged as pork and cut out of their budgets. So we basically had to, for the sake of supporting arts engagement from our police department, our probation department, our health department, et cetera, had to just shut up about it. But there is robust evidence around it, and what I don't see, and there's a couple of actors who are working to change this. There's NOAA, which I think is National Organization of Arts and Health. There's the Center for Arts and Medicine out in Florida. There's a couple of others who are looking to change the fact that the instances in which you see it aren't particularly well organized. They tend to be a foundation supporting arts for the sake of health, et cetera, as opposed to an element of the field. And that's something and we tend to be a part of those conversations, but that's something where we'd like to see real movement on, where it's like literally a movement, an organized movement.
Yeah, and I just also wanted to lift up, because I saw Shelley's comment here as well. It's funny that foundations often complain about how many nonprofits there are, but then they punish you if you go for fiscal sponsorship. They won't fund you if you're fiscally sponsored, or you need to be, whatever, around for 3 years or whatnot. So this goes to the city's policies, to nonprofit or to philanthropic policies of how do we reward individuals or programs for doing fiscal sponsorship? Because I resonate with what Leah said. So many people want to do good work in the community, but they have to fit within this box to get funding, and they're not ready for it, or nor should they be, right? I have to do a 501c3 in order to do this community-based project. And we all know what it takes to run a successful nonprofit. It's a lot of work. And so there's I think that's quote unquote low-hanging fruit. If we can as public funding and philanthropic funding start rewarding and encouraging fiscal sponsorships over nonprofits, and educating the communities what that looks like and what it is, would be really beneficial.
I completely agree. And we just released a blog about expenditure responsibility, for instance, because we've got a bunch of folks who've been coming to us and saying that the form that works for their applicants is small business ownership, even if it's individual proprietorship. And the presumption, and this is mostly coming from foundations, but the presumption is they can legally only support nonprofits, which is actually not true. A foundation may adopt bylaws that says that, in which case you have to intervene in your bylaws. But there's no, at a federal level, there's no policy that says a foundation has to only support nonprofits. The fact of the matter is, it's illegal. It's just a little more work on the foundation's part, which means it's more work on their lawyer's part and their accountant's part, which is probably where you're getting that advice to not do it. And it's more work on the IRS's part, where you're also getting the advice not to do it, but it's legal.
We're coming closer to the end of our time together. And I did want to address one more question in the chat before we give the three of you an opportunity to make some kind of closing remarks and wrap us up for the day. Wendy Sabin-Lasker, who's also an arts administrator within the county of San Diego and the city of Carlsbad, had some additional thoughts about fiscal sponsorships and the need for additional education on both sides of the equation to make those as successful as possible. Wendy, if I captured that correctly, yay or nay, or feel free to weigh in with the additional thoughts you had.
Thank you. Thanks for acknowledging that question. I couldn't agree more with Matt that there's a certain punishment or feeling of punishment that comes with the fiscal sponsorship issue. And I'm in a position now with a new grant category for the city to advise emerging artists who've never worked with a sponsoring agency. And I keep thinking about the need to educate on both sides, what's involved in the equation. And I wondered if anyone had experienced a program, a workshop, some way in which I could work with our artists and our arts organization communities to be excited about fiscal sponsorship. Jonathan's laughing. Matt had a good assessment of our situation here in San Diego and our situation here in Carlsbad. And meanwhile, I've got young emerging artists who want to work with the Title I schools, and they don't have their 501c3. I want to help them get a leg up. So any suggestions are welcome. Thanks.
Kamal, may I take that one?
Please.
So to begin with, Wendy, I don't think anyone is ever going to be excited about fiscal sponsorship. It is not sexy. But with that said, we at our office, we're happy to provide some information. And I have to call out Leah and Rise, who do a lot of this work countywide. But in the larger context, my closing comment was about systems. And if down the road we see delivery of cultural, artistic, and creative experiences to be more in the hands of individuals, I think something that we've lost in a lot of systems in many cities, and we definitely have this problem here in San Diego, is strong service organizations that have the capacity and the expertise to really provide those services. And I'm thinking about a few other cities that for many, many years had really robust organizations that in an ongoing way could create or could provide the training, but really importantly, house the initiatives as projects so the artists could actually do their work. So that is, and we know that that's something that philanthropy doesn't necessarily want to support because, again, it's not all that sexy and it's not direct, but I believe it's incredibly important.
I'd like to say that only in the USA do we ask artists to be artists and budgeters and fundraisers and everything else. Every other country, I mean, if you were in Russia or anywhere else, we would just be funding artists to be artists. And so, and then we also have to realize what we love so much about artists is that we are artists, and when we're focusing in the creative space, and there was not a thing creative about writing a grant or doing a budget or figuring out maybe finding a fiscal agent, but really they need um, a fiscal sponsor. You know, years ago, our dear friend Felicia Shaw was at the San Diego Foundation, and she had a great neighborhood challenge grant. And the grant gave you, you had an idea, you did this grant, and then along with your grant, you got a coach. And it was fabulous. So I was a coach in that program, and so somebody was like, "Oh, I've got this great mural program all over Barrio Logan, and we're going to do this, that, and the other, and we've identified these walls." And I was like, "Do you have an MOU with the shop owner? Like, if you put this mural up on this wall and the wall falls down, you know, do you want to be liable?" And so it's that sort of like, you know, that out of the box sort of a thinking, like in other words. And I just always get so sad when we're asking artists to be everything other than who they really are. Anyway, that's my 50 cents.
Eddie, go ahead and bring us home.
No, I'm really grateful we're closing on this note because, you know, this is an example of an educational effort, you know, what we're doing literally right here. And that's what you're talking about. And it speaks to the value of these kinds of conversations. It's because of these kind of conversations that we move forward as, you know, individual practitioners and supporters, but also it's how we move forward as a field. So again, it speaks to the issue of collective impact and our only being strong together.
Eddie, thank you so much for spending some time with us today. Jonathan, Leah, thank you so much for your insight and expertise. To everyone who hung out with us a little bit longer than we were scheduled to go, we appreciate your flexibility. And one last piece to kind of wrap up with, I would also hope that all of the funders who are on this call keep their eyes open for an invite to our first actual Arts and Intersections working group meeting. I want to be specific in that it's open to funders only, and we're hoping to continue these conversations and to bring in folks from outside of the arts and culture space to begin to kind of leverage the platform of arts and culture to address the critical issues that funders in racial equity and social justice and healthcare and education face. So stay tuned, much more to come. Appreciate you all, and thank you so much.